Thanks for having me. I'm glad that the journal is interested in climate change. Policy tends to be influenced most of all by economists and what I am inclined to think of as economistic thinking. And economistic thinking tends to blur all desires together. Everything is a preference. So if a starving child would like a drink of water, that's his preference. If an art collector would like another painting, that's his preference. And if you just call everything a preference, then you lose a lot of very important distinctions, like the one between wants and needs. And so this article, the one called Subsistence Emissions and Luxury Emissions, made a point of saying that some emissions are the result of people doing things they really need to do, and other emissions are results of people doing things they enjoy doing or would like to do, but don't really need to do, and that this should be taken into account if we're going to try to be just. So, for example, this is the difference between rich people who fly off to the other side of the globe to a beach they happen to like in Thailand or Malaysia just for the weekend, and so are responsible for generating a lot of climate emissions, and someone who once in a while takes a flight to visit their family. I would say the flights to visit the family are essential. They're not literally subsistence, but they're doing something that needs to be done. But flying off, 1 weekend a month to your favorite beach is not something that really needs to be done. So anyway, the point was we need to deal with all emissions, but we also need to set priorities. And so the idea was, if we're reducing emissions, which is, of course, what we're trying to do, we should start with the emissions that are the luxury emissions and not the ones that are the subsistence ones. This, you ask what this has to do with current policy. And of course, I wrote this article in 1992, 1993. So there's no guarantee it has anything to do with anything. But actually, I think this issue is still very much alive. Under the Paris Agreement, every nation has to set its own commitments on emissions reductions. These are the so-called nationally determined commitments, NDCs. And there's no enforcement mechanism in the Paris Agreement. So the only way to try to get nations to do what they've said they will do, that is, try to get them to fulfill their nationally determined commitments, is to bring political and moral pressure on them. And one way to do that is to say, you're not doing your fair share, which makes it, that's a point about justice, of course. It's what justice requires is that every nation do its fair share. But to decide whether a nation is doing its fair share, I think one has to take into account why it's generating as much emissions as it is. For example, people now are getting very excited about the fact that India's emissions are going up, which they certainly are. And of course, the last 2 decades, China's were going up. But let's stick with India for now. Insofar as the Indians are lifting people out of poverty with their emissions, that's very different from the rest of us generating emissions by flying off to holidays or, insisting on eating a lot of meat, which the production of which generates many more emissions than a vegetarian diet would. So when you look at the fact that India's emissions are going up, I think it's important also to ask, well, why is that? And what are these emissions being used for? And in assessing whether the Indian commitment is adequate, one needs to take into account what's being done with these emissions.